I'm here to introduce Dean Bosworth. You know, Dean Bosworth is probably is the most successful dean we've ever had at Fletcher over all the years, certainly that I've known deans. What's happened in the last 12 years has been remarkable. The school has grown in terms of students. It's grown dramatically in terms of course offerings. It's grown dramatically in terms of faculty. We've gone into whole new areas, Masters of Laws, the GMAT is strengthened, the MIB was built, all of which was done with very careful attention to not impacting the most important thing that makes Fletcher great, which is the underlying very special culture we have here. So the fact that you can make all these changes, make the school so much bigger and better, and yet leave the culture better than when you got there is quite a dramatic achievement that I think we all owe a lot to Steve for. Those are sort of the what questions. The more interesting questions are the why questions. Why was he able to do it? What was he able to do? And I'm convinced that Steve brings a unique three elements that are fairly unique in a leader. One element he brings, which is essential for any good leader, is good judgment. If you make a bad decision, and a big bad decision at a school like Fletcher, you can set us back a long way. And all his decisions, I think, were very good decisions. And he carried them out in a way that I said brought the culture along with him, so that the school today feels, to me at any rate, that we've never been in better shape than we are. A second element has to do with the fact that he himself personifies diversity. He's worked in a variety of business, academic, and of course, public service domains. He's worked all over the world. He's worked with all different kinds of people. So things that are different don't frighten him. In fact, they intrigue him, if anything else. And thirdly, he genuinely is very humble, human, and interested in the world. I think the ability to listen is what characterizes great leaders, and that's what Steve has at a great level. So we're about to welcome, I think, a very important and I'm sure successful successor to Steve, but there is no replacement for Steve. I give you Steve Bosworth, maybe for the last time in this forum.
Thank you. I had resolved before coming here that I was going to try to remain my normal, unemotional self. And I still pledge to try to do that. I don't guarantee success, but I will try my best. For Chris and myself, this chapter has come to a conclusion, and it has been a remarkable chapter in a remarkable book. So I have foregone the opportunity, hard for me to do, to opine on the vagaries of policymaking in a complex world of globalism, et cetera. Instead, what I'm going to do is sort of offer, as I've been reflecting over the last several months, on my own life and my 12 years here at Fletcher and 50 years of professional engagement. I would like to share with you some of those reflections. I stress not all of them, but some of them. And I trust they will be of some interest, if not of much value, but hopefully of some interest. I think, as you will discern, I must concede that in life I had no real plan. I am a product of my environment and my own experiences. I grew up, as some of you who have been in my office in the last several years will recognize, basically I grew up on a small farm, and the cows that are prominently displayed in my office are testimony to my many years, at least it seemed to me many years, of having to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to take care of all these animals. And I think that, well, at the time I would not have called it a positive experience, believe me. it nonetheless has shaped in many ways the rest of my life. And it's been an experience that I've drawn on constantly. I had no choice but to learn how to work, or at least how to do some work. And I also, as those of you who yourselves may have come from an agricultural background can testify, one quickly learns the reality of delayed gratification when one is engaged in farming. It is not something that you sow today and reap tomorrow that's important. It's what you sow today and may reap at some point in the somewhat distant past or future that really counts. And my life as a young boy in agriculture taught me the virtues of delayed gratification. My father was not a farmer. My father was a blue-collar worker who had started college when he graduated from high school in Michigan, but had to drop out after one semester to find a job in order to become the principal support for his 6 brothers and sisters. It was 1933, and the Great Depression was just beginning. I grew up with a father who was frustrated, committed to the value of higher education, and determined that his 3 sons had no alternatives but to pursue that. But he was a frustrated, though not bitter man. He never gave up on education, however. He received his college degree 2 years after I received mine, and became a high school teacher of English and speech. I went on to Dartmouth College because someone was a very poor judge of athletic talent. And managed to convince someone at Dartmouth that I not only could play Ivy League football, but also persuade them to give me a very generous package of financial aid. My football career lasted barely 1 season, but my gratitude to the concept and practice of financial aid has been with me forever. And I consider it one of the achievements that we've managed to produce here at Fletcher, to increase quite substantially, though still inadequately, the resources available for financial aid. At Dartmouth, I majored in international relations. And I stress, not because I knew then that I wanted to go on and join the Foreign Service. At that point in my life, at the age of 17, I barely knew what the Foreign Service was. But I chose that major because it assured me that I didn't have to concentrate on anything else. It was an interdisciplinary major, somewhat the same as the experience here at the Fletcher School. And I was able, therefore, to take a number of courses in different disciplines. And it was my first experience dealing with the general concept of international relations. I then faced the dilemma of what to do next. And I took the law boards, and I also took the Foreign Service exam. I managed to pass both of them, but there was one big difference. I couldn't find a law school that was willing to pay me a salary. And to my somewhat surprise, the State Department was willing to give me a salary. Rather meager salary, I would stress. And that condition has continued throughout the years, as you have so graphically mentioned. One does not join the State Department or any other aspect of public service in order to acquire wealth. But I remember vividly driving from Hanover, New Hampshire, having borrowed a car, because I didn't have one, down to Boston for my Foreign Service oral exam. In those days, and those of you who have been through this process recently will note the difference. In those years, you could take the written exam, and later that same year, they would invite you to go someplace to take the orals. And they would tell you right after the orals whether you passed or not. So in my case, the trip down was full of anxiety and some trepidation. But the trip back to Hanover, New Hampshire, and there was no I-93 or 89 in those years, was a very brief and very happy trip because they told me I'd passed right after that. They didn't tell me, however, when I might expect that salary would begin. And I think that still happens today. So I graduated from Dartmouth, this Ivy League establishment, went back to the small farm in Michigan, and started doing again what I'd been doing before I went away to Dartmouth. Fortunately, that summer, I got a telegram. We still had those in that day. And the State Department was offering me an appointment as a Foreign Service Officer Class 8. I'm not sure that even exists anymore, at the magnificent salary of $5,400, which in those years, frankly, seemed to me quite generous, and I wasted no time in accepting it. So the Foreign Service in those years was a very, what I would call now, a white shoe establishment. I mean, I had the educational credentials because I came from an Ivy League school, although not one that had produced anywhere near the number of Foreign Service officers that others had, but because it was actually in the Ivy League. The white shoe in the sense that it represented a slice of the socioeconomic culture in the United States with which I had almost no experience except tangentially occasionally at Dartmouth College. So I joined the Foreign Service, and after several months of training in Washington, was sent off to Panama, where I was in the U.S. in the embassy there in Panama City for a few months. And then, because our then ambassador had pledged to the public of Panama that he would never allow, he was a political appointee, that he would never allow the nefarious State Department to close our consulate in Cologne, our ambassador was faced with a dilemma. The State Department refused to assign anyone to that post in Cologne. So if he wanted to keep it open, he had to staff it out of the embassy in Panama City. And I think he concluded that of all the people in Panama City, the one he would miss the least, because God knows I hadn't been there very long, was me. So with my first wife and first child, we were packed off to Panama, to Cologne, Panama. I don't know how many people have been, in this audience, have been to Cologne, Panama. I suspect it has not changed a lot since I was there in the early 1960s. But in those days, it was still very much the city that had been built to house the workers who had been brought in to build the Panama Canal. It was not, in fact, Latin America. It was the Caribbean America. And the people who were there were the descendants of those early workers who had come to dig the canal. It was a strange but wondrous place for me in many ways. And I had the great pleasure at the age of 23 of being able to call myself the U.S. consul in Cologne, Panama. Now, when I introduced myself to people who didn't know Cologne, Panama, I would sometimes just say Cologne, and they all assumed I must speak German, which I still don't speak. But it was a marvelous opportunity, and one that I enjoyed very much, until in January of 1964, the Panamanians decided, understandably, that it had been long enough that they had been basically ruled as a sovereign territory of the United States. Alan will remember, but I don't know how many others have refreshed their memory of this recently. But when Teddy Roosevelt was president and took, as he said, I took Panama, he took the Canal Zone and ruled that the United States would rule in the Canal Zone as though we were sovereign. And that, to most Panamanians, was not really an acceptable condition. So in 1964, they started the long process of rebellion, rioting, etc. And needless to say, we were captured, or not captured, but seized in effect in Cologne because we were the only Americans there, and at least only official Americans there. and ended up being taken out of Cologne into the Canal Zone by the commander, the then commander of the National Guard in Cologne, who put us in the back seat of his personal car. We hunkered down and he covered us with a blanket, and we were smuggled into the Canal Zone and refuge. It was a remarkable time, and I had then the distinction of being the last American consul in Cologne, Panama. I went back eventually to Washington, where my first job in that strange building called the Department of State was to work on the beginnings of the renegotiation of the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty governing the administration of the Panama Canal. Some 10 years later, that resulted, in effect, in a new treaty in which the United States agreed within a given period of time to cede unlimited sovereignty to Panama and to give up the Panama Canal, which we subsequently did, honoring our good faith commitment. And I think was a singular development in terms of the U.S. credibility and presence throughout all of Latin America. In the early, following my time in the State Department on the Panama desk, I was assigned to Spain, where, if nothing else, I began my long experience with aging authoritarian dictators. This was in the person of Mr. Franco, who had ruled in Spain since the end of the Spanish Civil War. And Spain in those years was a almost kind of magical place in that if you were there, not as a Spaniard, but if you were there as a foreign diplomat, it was a marvelous place because life there had barely been interrupted, and it was as though the Civil War had never occurred, et cetera, et cetera. So I had 4 years in Spain and spent most of my time, or a lot of my time, traveling around the country, talking about the United States. And there was a great hunger for information about the United States. And while Spain in the Franco era was very much a dictatorship, it was not that repressive, or at least not as repressive as dictatorships we have subsequently known. So my 4 years there were relatively uneventful, but I went from Spain to France, where in the embassy in Paris, I was witness to the early formation of the European community and eventually to the EU. But that was a France, again, of quite a different era. France was not all that enthusiastic about expanding the community to allow the UK to come in. And I must say that in retrospect, French judgment may have been correct, and the UK may now be in the process of getting itself out. I very much hope that doesn't happen, but it very much is possible. From France, in one of my kind of periodic periods of dissatisfaction with the State Department and the Foreign Service, managed to wrangle myself an appointment as an exchange person to a bank in Chicago. My choice of banks was not terribly great because I chose a bank which a few years later would no longer exist, which is, of course, the case with many banks in the United States these days. I went back to the State Department eventually, having worked for Continental Illinois Bank and enjoying that very much. In the State Department, I began at that point my second tour there to get a kind of fuller taste of what life in the world of policymaking could be all about. This was at the time of early tensions in the U.S. relationship with what was then called, I think still is, the Group of 77, the developing countries of the world. I was struck always to know that the Group of 77 was really a group of over 100, but for reasons of doctrine, they called themselves the Group of 77. And I led the U.S. delegation to the endless talks that occurred in Paris, and it was an experience in multilateral diplomacy that was basically at those times without equal and served me well throughout the rest of my time in the State Department. I learned particularly the frustration of trying to marshal the positions of the multifaceted U.S. bureaucracy in a way that would allow us to be effective and coherent interlocutors and negotiators with the rest of the world. And we're still trying to do that, and it still is very difficult. After Washington and the State Department, I went on to become the ambassador to Tunisia. And Tunisia was a second in my experience with aging authoritarian dictators, but one who is the stuff of great stories. And this was Habib Bourguiba. In thinking about my remarks today, I recalled vividly two experiences with Bourguiba. And you probably all remember that Bourguiba was, in effect, he billed himself as the George Washington of Tunisia. He was the founder of Tunisia. Tunisia came out of World War II, and within a very few years, having been a French colony for many years, became independent. And Bourguiba was the father of that independence. He didn't rule in a very open and democratic manner, but neither also was he a despot. But he was, by the time I got there, he was aging. And he had persuaded himself that, in fact, this birth certificate that was shown to everyone who visited the Tunisian Museum, where he was prominently featured, which showed his birth date is 10 years later than it really was. He'd convinced himself that that was authentic. And he was showing some marked signs of slipping away and losing it. But I remember this was during the Iranian hostage crisis. And one of our great challenges throughout the Arab world, and particularly in Tunisia, was to try to secure votes for the UN Security Council resolution, which was passed in support of the U.S. position on the seizure of the hostages, demanding that the Iranians release them. And Bourguiba, alone among all of the Arab leaders, actually told me that, after I made several entreaties to him, that Tunisia would support that resolution. And he followed through on it. It was a marvelous demonstration of his personal commitment to his relationship with the United States, a relationship which had started because then now obscure and even then quite obscure American consul in the early 1940s, as World War II was developing. His name was Hooker Doolittle. And Hooker Doolittle knew Bourguiba and managed to arrange for Bourguiba's escape from Tunis in advance of the return of what was then the French army and French civil government, because they wanted Bourguiba. They were going to put him in prison as a rebel and an insurgent. So Hooker Doolittle managed to smuggle Habib Bourguiba out of Tunis. And Habib Bourguiba never forgot that. Now, unfortunately, what that meant for myself and subsequent American ambassadors was that as Bourguiba aged, he insisted on telling the story of Hooker Doolittle at least once during each of our visits to the presidential palace. And he told it with great, great animation. And he would point to a picture, a photo on the wall of himself and Hooker Doolittle, and he would say, "Voilà mon ami." And he would relish that moment. Well, it's a demonstration, however, that what you sow in diplomacy may not pay off immediately, but eventually it did. And I think Hooker Doolittle probably deserves much more credit than anyone else for the fact that Bourguiba told his delegate to the Security Council to vote in support of the UN resolution, and he did. So when the admiral of the Sixth Fleet came to Tunis later that same year, the admiral brought his ships into Tunis port, marvelous location geographically. And he wanted, of course, to call on the president to thank him personally. which I arranged to happen, and the Admiral and I went to the presidential palace. And he presented his midshipman's sword to the president. And for those of you who have any knowledge of the Naval Academy and what is the culture there, you recognize that this was indeed a singular gesture, because naval officers only get one midshipman's sword. And Bourguiba recognized the significance of this and was very, very excited to receive the sword. But unfortunately, he decided that he would unsheath the sword. And he drew it out of its scabbard. And the next thing I knew, the president's chief of protocol, the Admiral, and I were looking for some protection from Habib Bourguiba waving the sword over his head and trumpeting the virtues of his relationship with the United States. After Tunisia, I was asked to go back to Washington, where I became the Senior Deputy Assistant Secretary for Latin American Affairs. Now, those of you who have firsthand knowledge of Latin American recent history will recognize that the early 1980s was not a great time to take on any responsibility for U.S. relations with that large group of countries. It was the time of the Central American Civil War. It was the time of the Mexican debt crisis. And of course, it was the time of the Falklands War. And needless to say, for 18 months, my life was not quiet and not peaceful. And it was a very, very difficult period, both in U.S. policy in Latin America, but also in Steve Bosworth's life. Fortunately, George Shultz became Secretary of State in the early 1980s, and for reasons I've never understood, decided to rescue me from Latin American affairs and made me Director of Policy Planning, which may have been the single best job I ever had in the State Department, largely because you had no line responsibilities. You were primarily charged with second-guessing all of your colleagues around the building. And that, for me, would prove to be quite stimulating and quite heady. Unfortunately, or fortunately for me, actually, I shouldn't be too sardonic about it. George Shultz, after less than a year in that job, asked me to go back overseas, and although I had by this time decided I would probably retire early from the State Department and go on to do other things, he asked me to go off to the Philippines as ambassador. And when I had the temerity to suggest to him that I was no longer going to be a career Foreign Service officer, he said, "Yes, you are, because you're going to go to the Philippines, because I've asked you to do that." So, again, this was 1984. The Philippines was run by my third experience with authoritarian, aging dictators, Ferdinand Marcos. And the Philippines was in tough shape. We had seen the assassination of Ninoy Aquino, whose son is now president of the Philippines, and whose wife, Cory Aquino, went on to be president of the Philippines after Ninoy's assassination. Those were dramatic times. Living in the Philippines then, as Chris and I did, was kind of like being in a live morality play. The Philippines was constantly enduring demonstrations, rioting. There was effort by the democratic opposition to organize itself. And my task there is a challenge given to me by George Shultz and ultimately Ronald Reagan, was to somehow preserve U.S. interests through this tortuous period. And I remember Shultz's advice to me, which I've always taken to heart in every new job that I went into. His advice to me was, "Look, Steve, don't go out there trying to hit home runs. This is a very complicated situation. Let's have a couple of singles, maybe an occasional double, but build on that and don't try to be dramatic. And we don't want to be dramatic." So that was the approach I followed. We exercised what influence we had in support of the democratic opposition, and as I used to say, trying to create enough democratic space in this country so that the opposition could do what it was eventually able to do, and that is come together, help to organize elections, and hold those elections. Well, the elections did occur, and the opposition was, as you may remember, led by Corazon Aquino, and she came back and she won the election. But not surprisingly, Marcos decided he was not ready to step down. So he claimed that there had been fraud in the election and that he had actually won. The Filipino people would not accept that outcome, and the place erupted within just a few days. And we subsequently lived through this period of great drama, great suspense, and quite a lot of excitement. And eventually, with support from the United States, which did not happen automatically, but which was the product of long years, or months at least, of careful consideration and work on the part of George Shultz and others, including your humble former ambassador to Manila, the United States came out on the right side. And I had the dubious pleasure of telling Ferdinand Marcos that it was time for him to leave. And we put him on a plane, which eventually ended up in Hawaii, where he spent the rest of his life. Imelda went with him, and that was in some ways good. She had to go with him, but it was in some ways our loss in terms of entertainment. Because there was nothing quite like being in Manila as the U.S. ambassador and his wife when Imelda Marcos was the First Lady of the Philippines. Chris and I have vivid memories of Valentine's Day and other occasions in Manila when she insisted that we celebrate these festive events with her and her circle down at the presidential palace, much of the time in the presidential disco. Where I never really learned to disco. Chris was a little better at it than I was. But I do have vivid memories of, we had only been married less than a year at that point, of Imelda insisting that she give us a wedding reception soon after our arrival there. Needless to say, this is a newly arrived American ambassador whose charge was to create a little distance between the embassy and the Blue House, as it was known. This was not something I really embraced quickly. And I finally told the chief of protocol there that, okay, I would do this, but only if it was a very small occasion, maybe 8 or 10 couples, Filipinos and American business leaders, et cetera. And we would be honored to do that. Chris and I then had to go off for a conference in Jakarta. And when I came back, this was before the age of instant communication. When I came back, the deputy chief of mission smiled at me and said, well, he said, the small dinner has grown a little bit. And I thought, well, I hope not too much. The small dinner turned out to be a reception for 500 people with lots of dancing and occasions. And Imelda used to love to do fashion shows. And she did a fashion show that to me seemed endless. But when it came time to dancing, she insisted that I dance. And I tried to explain to her that I not only didn't dance, I also did not sing. And I think she never was convinced of the singing part, but after I'd stepped on her toes a few times, she was convinced of the dancing part. Anyway, our time in the Philippines was, to say the least, memorable. And I had the great experience of being present at the beginnings of a new commitment by the Philippines to democratic practice and democratic principle. Now, they have continued that in the years since I've left, not always with perfection, and I think Filipinos would agree to that most immediately, but always with, from Paulo's remarks, with some endurance. And they've managed to endure, and I think they will continue to endure. Democracy has very deep roots in the Philippines. They practice it in their own particular way, but they are really committed to the democratic process. I then did retire for the first time from the State Department, not because I was sort of actively discontented, but because after the Philippines, I really couldn't think of anything else I wanted to do. And I thought there were still other things in life that I would try to experience. So I worked in the foundation world for a time. We lived in New York. That was very, very rewarding, and I enjoyed it. I got to know a lot about Japan because the foundation was the U.S.-Japan Foundation. Then in the mid-1990s, some of my old colleagues in the State Department prevailed upon me to do something which I was convinced was the wrong thing. But the U.S. and North Korea had just set up a new arrangement whereby they would give up their nuclear weapons program and we would build for them 2,000 megawatt light water reactors. Now that seems counterintuitive, the combination of those two things, but believe it or not, the light water reactors were going to be proliferation resistant. So I agreed to do that. I was the first employee of the Korea Energy Development Organization. We put it in New York because that was where I was living. And the United States, together with Japan and South Korea, began the process of dealing with the North Koreans. And for me, this was a unique experience. Proved to be not all that unique, but at the time it was unique. And we sat down with the North Korean delegation and worked out the terms and conditions of the arrangement whereby we would come in to build this reactor. I learned a lot about the two Koreas. I learned what it was like to be the meat in a Korean sandwich, so to speak. And I began to understand what a terrible regime was governing North Korea. And I'm sorry to say that same regime, although with a different face, is still governing in North Korea. And the Korean Peninsula remains a divided peninsula between North and South, and it remains a place where the principles of democracy, basic respect for human rights, all the things that we hold dear to ourselves as both our own country and also in the practice of our foreign policy, continue not to be respected. I thought by the time I left to become the U.S. ambassador to Seoul, an invitation which I embraced, that probably I was pretty much done with direct exposure to North Korea, only to realize later in life that one is never truly done with North Korea. And I went back to be, while also serving as dean here, to be the special representative for North Korean policy in Washington under Hillary Clinton. It was quite an experience. I'm glad I did it, although at the time I was not glad every day that I was doing it. I was able, after 2.5 years, to return to the sanity of the Fletcher School. I would like basically to offer a few observations briefly on U.S. foreign policy, only to demonstrate how difficult it can be. We have struggled throughout our history to find what we would consider an appropriate role in this world. It has been especially difficult for us to find the right balance between diplomacy, of which we as a country don't have full appreciation, and the use of our substantial military power. We sometimes get it right, but only eventually. And I think we're closer to getting it right now than we have been for some time. But this is a dilemma that the U.S. has faced, and while I think continue to face, largely because the practice of diplomacy is not something which comes naturally to a democracy. It certainly does not come naturally to this democracy. We hopefully will get better at it as time goes on, but it is that balance which is so difficult. And what is so difficult also is finding the right role for ourselves in a world which keeps shifting from what I found when I came into the Foreign Service long years ago was the Cold War, which eventually became the post-World War II period. That went into the post-Vietnam period, then eventually the post-Cold War period. And now I think we're living through the post-9/11 period. And each time we have to kind of re-look at our foreign policy compass and decide what it is we're trying to do. There is a tension in our country between wanting, on the one hand, to do everything and to be responsible for everything, and on the other hand, wanting to be responsible for virtually nothing outside our own national borders. And I commend you and the graduating class, because you are the ones who, again, are going to have to take on the burden as active citizens in the United States or in your own countries of dealing with that division, that tension between our power and our moral compass and what it is we want to try to accomplish in this world. I'd like to say just a few words and then conclude about my time here at the Fletcher School. I had the pleasure of coming here in 2001 as the post-9/11 world was just beginning. For me, this has been a life experience. There is no way I can adequately express what our time here at Fletcher has meant to Chris and myself. I have tried to be faithful to the need for continuity, but also the need for change. And I hope and believe myself that we've managed to blend those two things. Fletcher today is, I think, essentially the same institution that it was when I arrived here 10 years ago. It certainly has the same moral character, the same culture in many ways, but I will also say it is a different place than it was. It's more programs, useful and important programs, a larger number of students, students who I think have very easily come into the Fletcher tradition of being active citizens in the world, active in your own countries, and a place that has tried over the last 10 years and before to adjust to the changing realities of the world. We are blessed to have a faculty which is committed to excellence in both teaching and research, and I think the faculty remains, in many respects, the backbone of this institution. It is also a place, though, that we continually ask ourselves, what makes Fletcher so special? And our board, in its meeting yesterday, asked me that question, perhaps made the mistake of asking me that question. So I was able to talk about it for a few minutes, and I want to share my bottom line conclusion with all of you here today. The faculty is, of course, essential. There's no replacement for it. The alumni body is an irreplaceable part of the Fletcher community, and its support is critical to the maintenance of this school as a first-rank teaching institution and institution of higher education. But the key, I believe, to the Fletcher School's success is our ability in the future to continue to attract high-quality, motivated students such as yourselves. And I want to personally applaud all of the graduating students who have continued this tradition here at the Fletcher School. What we are because of students like yourselves. And what we will be in the future depends upon our continued ability to attract students like yourselves to come here from around the world. Without the students, we wouldn't have the faculty. I know personally from firsthand experience, the reason that the faculty is drawn here and stays here is the quality of the students. We would sometimes like to think the students come because of the quality of the faculty, and there is a certain synergy to that. But it is the quality of the students. And here I think it is the responsibility of the Fletcher administration and the Fletcher alumni to continue to assure that Fletcher has the wherewithal, the financial wherewithal, to attract students here who will present and offer the same quality and the same commitment to the principles of this institution that you all continue to represent. So I come to the conclusion, which is, as is the case with all remarks at this time of year, supposed to be focused on advice to you, the graduates. I would hope that maybe what I had to observe about my own career and the trajectory of that career will be of some utility to some of you in trying to map out your own careers. I think it is important to live what I've described as an examined life, but it is not as easy to do as it might sound. And I can't say that I've always lived an examined life. Frequently, life is what happens. We all have the tendency to accept life as it comes. But unless we examine what has happened and what we've done, we have very little basis on which to examine future alternatives as they present themselves to us. So I would urge you, the graduates, to examine your choices at the time you make them, of course, but also in retrospect, not as second guessing, but try to develop the texture of experience which will help you to assure that you make good choices in the future. I would also urge you not to be anxious. And I know that for those of you, and there are several, who don't yet have a fix on what you're going to do next after Fletcher, this is a time of some anxiety. I can testify, however, that if the past is any guide to the future, and I think it is, that 85% more or less of you, come November of this year, will have jobs. Many of you already do have jobs, but those who don't get anxious. Don't be worried. Be confident and be assured that the jobs will be coming. You have acquired here some essentials. You have acquired a framework for acquiring or for building knowledge. And with time and your own experience, you will have the opportunity to turn that knowledge into wisdom. And wisdom is a very elusive commodity, but it is one which, if we're fortunate enough and we are around here long enough, we will eventually acquire as well. You will, of course, have a great network, and you've already begun building that. And do not underestimate the importance of your Fletcher network. For most of our graduates, I think they've found, and you can talk to some of the alumni who are back here, they found that the Fletcher network is at the core of their life network. And when they need something or need to consult with people in the future, they most immediately reach out to their former fellow students here at Fletcher. And my final admonition or advice to all of you is, for God's sakes, have fun. Thank you very much.